Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. And I want you to welcome back tonight one of the smartest young ladies I've had the pleasure of interviewing a few times already. And I think she's got some really interesting views on Canada's Arctic, Canada's natural resources, Canada's critical minerals, and what we should be doing. Let me introduce you again to Heather Exner-Pirot. She is Director of Energy, Natural Resources and Environment Programs at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. We've also talked a lot about Indigenous relations and partnerships with Indigenous groups. And so I think you've taken, Heather, a very interesting view of a lot of the issues that are going on in Canada today. And one of them that I saw just 2 weeks ago was about Canada could have been an energy superpower. Mm-hmm. Instead, we became a bystander. If Shell Oil took a hatchet to the Canadian oil industry, the election of the Liberals in 2015 brought on its deathbed by 1,000 cuts. For the last 8 years, federal policies have incrementally and cumulatively damaged the domestic oil and gas sector. With the benefit of hindsight in 2023, it's obvious that this has had major consequences for global energy security as well as opportunity costs for Canadian foreign policy. Really? Wow. So we could have been a superpower and we're a bystander.
Let's talk about that, Brian.
Please.
So I don't know. I mean, look at Canada. We are the second largest country in the world. That means that we have a lot of resources, any way you cut it. Look at the way that Russia has used its resources as leverage for its foreign policy in the last 3 years. And it may have badly backfired. I think Europe maybe had, a stronger upper lip, stiffer upper lip than we thought. But it would never even try to go into Ukraine if Europe and Germany in particular wasn't so dependent on its gas. And even still today, LNG exports from Russia are increasing to Europe. They put sanctions on the pipeline gas, but they are increasing LNG exports. And not to mention the oil, where, we had a price cap on Russian oil to try to, kind of curtail Putin's powers. Their oil is selling above the price cap because people want it so badly, because people need it so badly. So Russia's one case. You know what? The other thing I like to say, Venezuela is smarter with their resources on their foreign policy, more strategic. Qatar is more strategic. Kuwait is more strategic. I don't think there is a country that is less strategic than Canada, given the natural resources that we do have. Commodities are capital G geopolitics. We're the world's fourth largest producer of oil, the sixth largest producer of natural gas. We have all the critical minerals, and we do almost nothing on the foreign policy side with it. We kind of, just kind of willy-nilly, sell it mostly to the United States and let them use it for their capital G geopolitics.
How did we get into this situation?
Well, the innocent explanation is that the United States wanted everything, we would sell them. And so we didn't think about, especially in the oil and gas front, that basically all of our pipes go south, and everyone knows the drama. Finally, TMX will give us some kind of export capacity for oil. Coastal GasLink will give us some kind of export capacity for LNG. But today, in 2023, we have virtually none. I think we send about 96% of our oil, 99% of our natural gas in the United States. Remember, I just told you that we are the world's fourth largest producer of oil and the sixth largest producer of natural gas. And all of that is flowing south to the United States.
At prices below world market prices, correct?
That's the very important part, Brian. Because we have no other options, the Americans can, give us basically their price setters, and we're price takers. This is what we just known as a differential. So because we don't have any other options, no other markets we can get it to, we'll take what the Americans will give us. Often the Western Canada select the WCS barrel, that's the grade quality of the barrel that we sell, the benchmark, versus the West Texas Intermediate, the WTI barrel, if you ever hear about these acronyms. Sometimes the differential has been so bad. In 2018, the differential was so bad. I think WCS was selling for $11 a barrel and WTI was selling for about $50. So just the amount of money lost. And Frank McKenna, who's now the chair of TD Bank and used to be the premier, I think, in New Brunswick, used to be an ambassador, I think, to the United States. He did the calculation. He said between 2012 and 2018, the cost of the Canadian economy of not having export terminals, export pipelines, was $112 billion. Just because that differential price is so punitive. Same on the natural gas. Now we're doing it again. the Alberta, BC natural gas that we sell through, through the Alberta price, hub, is again so much cheaper. It's often the cheapest in the world. The United States buys it and they sell it at a premium to foreign markets as LNG. Or they backfill their domestic demand with Canadian natural gas, and then they use their natural gas from the Permian and the Marcellus and sell that as LNG, sometimes for 4 or 5 times the price. So again, we are selling our oil and our natural gas for cheap. The United States is buying it for cheap because we have given ourselves no other options.
But our gas, our LNG is in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and you either got to go across 3/4 of a continent to get to an ocean, or you got to go across the Rocky Mountains to get an ocean.
Well, it's not impossible, Brian. So we are building a pipeline. We already have the TMX. The TMX is an expansion. So yes, you can go through mountains. How much is it easier? This is, so natural gas producers in Alberta, thought the same as you. Geez, we can't go over these mountains. They won't let us build a pipeline. They're going about 4 or 5 times the distance, piping it all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. Canadian natural gas from northern Alberta and northern BC is getting piped down by Tourmaline all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico and selling it there because we are too slow to build our own pipeline in our own country and sell it from our own terminals. I tell you that this is not in Canada's best interest.
So a year ago, the Chancellor of Germany came to Atlantic Canada and asked for an LNG facility, and we were told there wasn't a business case for an LNG facility.
We were told there wasn't a business case. In the meantime, the United States has become the world's #1 exporter of LNG, has made tens of billions of dollars off it in the process. Europe is grateful to the United States for stepping up and selling all that LNG because they really needed it. And in the meantime, they're off making deals with OPEC partners and deals in the Middle East. OPEC is an oil cartel, but basically a lot of the players are the exact same. So they're going to players like Qatar, which is an authoritarian dictatorship, doesn't have a great human rights record, and is putting together, 20, 25-year deals with Qatar. So
they had the World Cup. They're not that bad.
Sure. Yeah. But how are they better than Canada for Europe? For Europe of all places. So just as an example, so now there's war in the Middle East. Qatar has strong feelings about this, obviously, as an Arab nation. And there was a rumor, turned out as a rumor, but the rumor was, Qatar is going to cut off natural gas exports unless Israel leaves Palestine and has a ceasefire. It was a rumor, but the fact that a couple billion people thought it was true is because maybe it could really happen, because it happened in 1973, the last time we had that big embargo. So I am telling you that all states eventually will use their resources as leverage to advance their interests. And I don't fault any country for doing that. I fault Canada for not even trying.
And so we're a bystander.
So we're a bystander. And it's not even oil, and it's not even just gas. It's also the critical minerals. Again, I think everyone understands that we need, things like copper, nickel, cobalt, rare earths, manganese, things to advance the energy transition, and then just to supply our everyday, things in the digital world. So we need these minerals for a lot of different things. Canada is producing less critical minerals in 2022 than this is the last year for data that's available than it was in 2019. In a lot of cases, in some commodities, than it was in 2005. We have not had any capacity to ramp up and to meet the need. The IEA says we need 6 times more critical minerals to meet net zero 2050. To meet the goals by 2040, we need 6 times more to get on the way. And Canada isn't even 1 times the critical minerals that we were producing 5 years ago. So again, another case where surely our allies would like to buy from us rather than from China, or rather from the Congo, or rather from Indonesia, but we are simply not producing anything that they can take. Uranium, another case, maybe this is the one that will finally be a winner on. The Northern Saskatchewan Athabasca region, I've talked to you about this before, is the richest deposit of uranium. Nuclear, I think, is the future. Uranium prices have been skyrocketing in the last 4 months. If we can start to approve some of those mines and get some of that uranium to market, that will help the energy transition go faster, and it'll also secure some pretty long-term deals and some pretty long-term dependence on Canada. So we'd be wise to think now strategically for the nuclear age the way we absolutely have not in the energy age.
So we got to figure out what went wrong and how we solve it. And Heather Exner-Pirot is someone who I think can help us in that regard. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in 2 minutes on the Brian Crombie Radio Wire with Heather Exner-Pirot talking about Canada being a bystander rather than a leader in the energy industry when we could be a superpower. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting with Heather Exner-Pirot. She is with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. She's a director of energy, natural resources, and environment with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. We've chatted about lots of different issues in the past, and she's recently written an article about energy and that Canada could be a superpower in energy, but we're a bystander. Heather, what got us in this situation? You know, you think about carbon taxes, you think about sort of fights between Alberta and the federal government, you think about our Minister of the Environment that some people thought was more of an environmentalist than someone that was thinking about the future of our economy necessarily. You think about maybe the Liberal Party and the Liberal government being more in central Canada oriented versus, you know, Western Canada oriented. But one would think we're smart people and we would have done smart things. So what got us in this situation?
So, you know, again, the innocent explanation is that Canadian oil and gas had a hard time competing with shale. So what is shale? What is this shale revolution? If your listeners remember, in 2008, oil saw a huge spike to $147. And there is a talk about peak supply, that we were running out of oil, and oil was very expensive. That caused the Arab Revolution, the Arab Spring, caused a lot of hardship, caused a lot of turmoil. The financial crisis exacerbated all that. And what saved us from that was the shale revolution. So this combination of hydraulic fracturing or fracking and horizontal drilling that just opened up a lot more hydrocarbons under the ground to become economic and accessible. And so
in the United States.
So the technology is in the United States, but you can apply that technology anywhere. They've just been very good at it. And very advanced. And Europe, for example, has banned fracking. Some jurisdictions have banned fracking. So the United States has made a lot of hay out of it and have been the best at it. But to your point, it means that there isn't peak supply kind of at all, that a lot of jurisdictions around the world can use those technologies to access more hydrocarbons at a cheaper rate.
So hold on a second. I'm sorry to interrupt your story, but let's dissect this a little bit. So Europe banned it. I presume for environmental reasons. Were they correct in banning it for environmental reasons?
Well, I mean, I don't happen to think so, because I think when people, I mean, Europe's done a lot of things. Like, you can talk about some other European bans on GMOs, for example, so they've done a lot of things that, with the benefit of hindsight, seemed alarmist at the time. So
Germany closed down all its nuclear power plants.
Exactly. And I think in 10 years, there's a lot of decisions that Europe's going to reverse. And one of them may very well be fracking, because they certainly need some more local sources of natural gas. But there was the concern at the beginning, like I say, 2008, 2010, when this really took off, that it would, poison water supplies, it would create, earthquakes and all these things. And now we've been doing it for, 15 years at scale. And those things haven't happened. So the worst case scenario that people, raise the alarm bells about haven't happened. Is certainly there are environmental impacts. No one will ever say there's no environmental impact, but certainly they can be managed. Certainly we've got better at it. There's some ways with horizontal drilling has incredible environmental benefit. So instead of having to have, 100 wells over the same amount of land, just kind of, pocking kind of the landscape, now you can have a handful of rigs that drill down and then drill horizontally. It can access all those hydrocarbons without having to be right on top of it. So there are many positives of this technology. Not to mention, you are accessing more oil and gas with less drilling. Anyway, so has anything, has the world crashed in 15 years? Is everyone's water poisoned since we started doing this? No, Brian, it's not.
What about communities in the United States that have done fracking? Have those communities been damaged environmentally?
I mean, I mean, I'm sure there are incidents where some poor faith actors came and went and didn't follow the regulations. If you follow the regulations, and the regulations are tight and regulators know what they're doing, then in general, no. I mean, there's fracking in Alberta where I live, and the water's pretty good out here. So it's just a matter of applying good regulations. This can be done well. And regulations may vary from some jurisdictions, and they may vary, in their application by some industries, but those are all things under our control. Those are all things that you can manage.
So I was in Alberta last week, and I've been in Fort McMurray recently, and I think the typical sort of knee-jerk reaction from a lot of people in central Canada, Toronto, might be that no, people out west don't believe in climate change, and they just want to, pump out oil and gas and create carbon emissions. I was shocked at how everyone talked about sustainability issues, about carbon capture, about lots of more conversations about hydrogen than I've had in Toronto. Almost like they were on a hydrogen religion. What do you think? Is Alberta in the natural resource business a believer in climate change?
These guys in downtown Calgary don't care about producing oil and gas. They care about producing money. And so if they think there's some advantage, if they can produce money out of hydrogen, out of blue hydrogen, if there's a premium, if other customers are going to pay a premium, they will certainly do it. If they need to do carbon capture to get the social license from Albertans, from Canadians, from Indigenous communities in which they, on the territories on whom they operate, from potential customers who may pay a premium one day, for a lower GHG intensity barrel, they will absolutely do that. And here's the thing, their shareholders and their bankers also want them to reduce their greenhouse gas intensity, and their workforce wants them in general to reduce their greenhouse gas intensity. So I can't tell you how much money and how much time goes in Alberta. I don't have the stat right in front of me, but something like 3 times more money now is just statistic that came out 2 weeks ago. Oil and gas spends about 3 times more on clean tech than on process improvements for oil and gas compared to 2014. So the money is pouring into clean tech, and again, it's carbon capture, and we're hoping you can be leaders and that you could monetize the technologies that you're developing, that you can sell blue hydrogen. The net zero petrochemicals industry, Dow is spending billions of dollars here. Other chemical companies are spending billions of dollars here because they have cheap feedstock. But if we can capture the carbon, we have all the infrastructure, we have the geology to capture the carbon, then they'll pay a premium for it. That's our competitive advantage, we think, is that if you set up shop here, you'll have access to cheap feedstock, and we'll capture that carbon so you can say you have a net zero product.
And I saw solar farms everywhere.
Well, that's a contentious one. I mean, I think there's absolutely a place for solar and for wind. Alberta has great solar assets because of the nature of its electricity grid. It was more, it's private. It was easier and faster for developers to develop solar, but now, of course, Danielle Smith's government has put a moratorium on it. I will say that you do have to think carefully, and we've seen the chaos in Texas, chaos in California, chaos in Germany, when you don't think through the intermittency of renewables, that you do have to have a plan. But just having a blanket moratorium like that, I think, was a very inelegant solution to the problems that we're facing.
So do we need a national energy program?
I won't. No, we need to, a regulatory system that's functional. Basically, that's the number one ask, is have a regulatory system that is clear and transparent, and that when you start a project, you can tell your board how long you think it'll take and how much you think it'll cost to move that project forward. Right now, there is so much uncertainty. No CEO can tell that to their board. And so no one's approving any projects for moving forward.
But we've been talking about in Ontario, the Ring of Fire, for it seems 2 decades, and we still haven't built the required infrastructure to the Ring of Fire, which I don't even know where it is, but we keep on talking about it. And you've talked to me about the incredible natural resources in Saskatchewan, Alberta, northern BC, etc. Why don't we have a natural resource strategy to exploit those resources that we have and become an energy superpower? Why don't we?
Well, there is now a critical mineral strategy. I'll give the federal government credit on that, but it's the implementation, is easy. The easy part is putting out a strategy. And also the easy part, they put that strategy out of, basically 7 years of suffocating the mining industry. And I know suffocating. I know when people hear about the Impact Assessment Act or C-69, we're complaining the loudest in Alberta. So you think it's about pipelines, and you think it's about oil, and you think it's about natural gas. The most affected industry by the Impact Assessment Act is mining. And the Mining Association in Canada will tell you that themselves. And is the most projects that go under for assessment is in mining. The timelines, why aren't we producing more critical minerals than we were in 2019, Brian? Because mining is suffering and they feel starved for capital. The cost of this is the one for everyone. Sometimes Minister Wilkinson says, oh, it's too bad, it can't take 12 years for Canada to develop a mine. We have to be faster. 12 years is a pipe dream. The average amount of time is 17.9 years. This is S&P Global analysis. They actually looked at the last dozen mines that we did build, gave the average of it in Canada, 17.9 years. In Australia, it's 14.5. In the United States, it's 13.9. I want people to think, the cost of capital with interest rates where they are right now. And I tell you, the mining sector, especially junior miners, pay a lot higher interest rate than you do for your house. The cost of capital, if you're going to add 3 or 4 years to a project, you just blew up tens of millions of dollars.
Why does it take that long?
Because we are uncoordinated, because we are duplicating our system. That's what the mining sector, the oil and gas sector is not asking for no regulation. They're asking for one regulation. Let the province do it, or if it's nuclear, let the feds do it. Let one jurisdiction do it. In Canada, instead, with the Impact Assessment Act, what it did is it said basically any project in Canada that affects water or Indigenous peoples, which is all of them, the federal government can also put under it, designate under its Impact Assessment Act. So what the resource sector is facing is having to go through 2 separate, often competing approval processes. And then you get the approval, then you have to get permits, on all kinds of things, building a culvert, building a road, layers and layers of permits, having a fuel cache, having an airway strip, all these things with different jurisdictions. I think that Mining Association of Ontario has a little graphic of, the number of agencies and ministries involved in building one mine. It was like 13 different government agencies, federal, provincial, or maybe municipal, Indigenous, different ministries, different agencies. You are suffocated by red tape, and all that is just time and money. It's not coordinated. There's no urgency on the side of government to do it better.
Suffocated by red tape and regulation. That's what's happening.
You're in the lands business, Brian. This can't sound unfamiliar to you. I'm telling you, it's the same, and it's affecting supply and demand in the exact same way.
Well, 17 years sounds a little bit extreme.
It is devastating. If you think about our energy transition and the goals we have, that we need to, let's say, triple, some of these critical minerals, let alone 6 times. And it's going to be 18 years until all these mines are up and running. If you start now, the timelines don't match.
And if we don't increase, which I think is the big issue, if we don't increase our mining of some of these critical minerals that are needed for electric batteries, for all the toys that we're using these days, and we know that consumers are going to be demanding it, and from an energy standpoint, we're going to be demanding electric cars and batteries. Who's going to supply those critical minerals?
Well, the first answer is no, and there isn't enough supply. There are not enough reserves. There aren't enough mines. There isn't enough investment in the mining industry globally. Canada may be, an extreme case, but this is a global problem. I've looked this up. I'm obsessed with it. So the Prospectors Developers Association in Canada put out some information a couple months ago. Mining finance, investment, equity, and debt in the mining sector, global mining sector in 2022 is about 1/3 what it was in 2013. And that was the last peak of the last resource boom. Commodity prices are still not today, Brian, at the level And for long enough, they're still so volatile that no one wants to pull the trigger and say, okay, this is the time for us to make a decision, because they're going up and down. So the mining sector is still not building for the energy transition. The interest rates are killing it. Supply chain killed it. The permitting burden everywhere is killing it. It's just, we are nowhere near on track for the critical minerals that we need.
But I think you've told me in the past that the countries that will produce are the countries that aren't our friends.
So China is the world's #1 miner. It has the most mining product by ton. I think the United States might be #2, Russia's #3. Australia's #4, and Canada is down the list, 7 or 8, depending on the year. So we're nowhere near punching our weight, by the way, for the second biggest country in the world. But China is not only the world's #1 miner, it is the world's #1 processor of all these materials. So it's just, you can't just take this refined ore and, stick it in a battery. To, the kind of lithium that you need, the purity of lithium that you need for batteries, the purity of copper that you need for transmission. Chinese are excellent at it, and they're very cheap at it. And so even for us to friendshore, to onshore that, those prices of those things are going to go up. But at any rate, they have near monopolies on some of the most, on the processed version of some of the most important critical minerals, certainly for the energy transition. And we are doubling down on the solar panels, on the transmission, on the batteries, on the electrification. We are doubling down on our dependence on China, just as we just saw the lesson that Europe just learned with Russia. I have zero doubt that China will use its dominance in critical minerals to its strategic advantage at the time that it thinks is right. And so, yes, we had better start to think strategically about our critical minerals. We still are not.
We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes with Heather Exner-Pirot, talking about critical minerals, talking about resources, talking about how we could be in Canada an energy superpower. And as she's described us, we're a bystander, not a terribly great evaluation. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Heather Exner-Pirot, and as I mentioned on the top, she's one of the smartest young ladies I've had the pleasure of introducing to my audience. She's got a PhD in political science from the University of Calgary. She has got an incredible career background. She started out as a strategist for outreach and Indigenous engagement at the University of Saskatchewan, a coordinator for UTARCTIC, Northern Nursing Education Network, an editorial board member for the Canadian Foreign Policy Journal, a chair of the Canadian Northern Studies Trust, a research associate for an Observatoire de la Politique et la Sécurité de l'Arctique, a principal consultant with Morris Interactive, a managing editor of the Arctic Yearbook, a board member of the Saskatchewan Indigenous Economic Development Network, a board member of the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation, a research advisor for the Indigenous Research Network, a global fellow with the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., a senior fellow and director of energy, natural resources, and environment at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and a special advisor for the Business Council of Canada. What a background. And I got to ask you, with a PhD in political science, how did you become such a geek in natural resources?
Well, that's a great question. So I was, really started out on kind of Arctic and Indigenous development, as you can kind of see from my resume there. And Arctic and Indigenous development always eventually got to resource development. So it was really about, what kind of resource do we want in the Arctic? What kind of resource development do we want for Indigenous communities? And that's where I really started writing for Macdonald-Laurier Institute, was on Indigenous resource development, the benefits they were getting, some of the models for greater participation. Now we're seeing a big equity deals, that kind of thing. And so I was adjacent to resource development, but I'm from Saskatchewan. I always followed very closely Cameco and uranium because they were actually excellent, the first kind of excellent mining company, resource company with Indigenous relations. I moved to Calgary and I was supporting some Indigenous groups, some chiefs on C-69, Impact Assessment Act, when they were intervening, originally in Senate hearings back in 2018, 2019. So that's how I got in. It was really IAA and C-69 into resource development. What really changed was the Russian war in Ukraine. And all of a sudden, energy security was back at the top of the list. Commodities, we're had a good year. We're getting more expensive. That created inflation. And I think we started to say, we really need to look at our resources, not just from a climate change perspective, but from an economic perspective, from a political perspective. And we absolutely have not been doing that since 2015. So we have a little bit of digging out to do. And really the opportunity, I think we're heading into a commodities upside of, a new boom. I think everyone sees that commodities move in cycles. So it eventually will go into a new boom. I think it's happening now. And Canada, if we're smart about it, could really benefit and really contribute.
You wrote an interesting paper on IAA, the Supreme Court decision on IAA, and it was called "The Government of Canada Needs to Come to Grips with the Supreme Court's IAA Decision." Tell me what this is all about.
So IAA means Impact Assessment Act. So this is how the federal government assesses major projects. Sometimes it's pipelines, sometimes it's mines, but it could be interprovincial transmission lines. It could be ports. There's a lot of things. It could be refineries, a lot of things, a lot of major projects. Most major projects come under the way they've designed it. So back when the federal Liberals introduced this, as it was, the bill was called C-69 before it was passed. And so if people remember Bill C-69, No More Pipelines bill, that was the decision, the appeal was made today. So in Alberta, there was certainly a sense that the IAA was created so that the federal government could say no to every pipeline and every oil sands project ever again. And certainly under the IAA, the government had the authority to do so, that it could evaluate any major project it wanted, basically, under and assess, its GHG emissions, for one. It has a gender-based analysis plus you have to conduct. I think on the government website says it's a way of thinking rather than a prescribed set of rules. So many vague and Orwellian ways that they can block projects. And that's how Alberta perceived it. So the Alberta government appealed it. They said, this is unconstitutional. Natural resources is clearly in our constitution with our division of powers. Natural resources is for the province. And the federal government was clearly overreaching with the Impact Assessment Act. The Alberta court ruled in the favor. They said, yes, that's correct. They said it smacked of paternalism. They said it was, gross federal overreach, and that it was unconstitutional. Canada, obviously, the federal government appealed that, so it went to the Supreme Court of Canada. And that's the decision that came out last week. And no one is expecting it out here. It was a surprise. It was, the decision, they said it was going to come out Friday the 13th. Everyone made jokes, so it's going to be, Nightmare on Elm Street. We're all bracing for the worst. And here, a majority of the court, oh, by the way, the Alberta judge was in some kind of scandal, so the Alberta judge wasn't even presiding in this one. They said it was unconstitutional. They agreed with the Alberta court and said that, yes, this was federal overreach. About 90% of it is unconstitutional, and they have to go back to the drawing board. And the federal government's response was, we could solve this with a couple minor amendments. And you're in your article are saying, no, it's going to be a complete rethink. Yeah. So and that one was, with my colleague Martin Ignaziuk, who's a lawyer at Bennett Jones. Bennett Jones happened to represent Alberta, and he's a fantastic regulatory lawyer who has defended a lot of major projects against kind of federal incursions. But yes, so right in the press conference right after, you'd think that maybe the government having their legislation declared unconstitutional wasn't, Alberta was the instigator, but 8 other provinces joined Alberta. This wasn't just an Alberta thing. None of the provinces want federal overreach. Ontario certainly didn't. You'd think that maybe they would be chastened, but of course not. So 2 hours later in their press conference, they're saying they're heartened, that the court said there could still be federal assessment at all, and that they think they will, come back with a few tweaks as soon as possible. And keep going on their merry way. And the business sector and Alberta views this very differently.
That it's a major change.
It has to take major changes. If they don't do the changes, they'll just end up going back in court. And what I had a Globe Mail article last week, and this is what I said is, we have a bad unconstitutional policy. Let's not make a bad constitutional policy. let's have a good constitutional policy. Here's an opportunity. You have to go back to the drawing board anyways. How about think about how you can respect provincial rights while still upholding, all your federal responsibilities on the environment and with Indigenous peoples, but work with the provinces, work with industry. Instead of us being polarized and fighting, let's come up with something that helps us build. Whether you want to build for the energy transition, whether you want to build for, security with our allies, whether you want to build, to prop up our economy, which is stagnant. For all these reasons, we need a better regulatory system.
Canada's got a problem. Our productivity is 30% below the United States. Our prosperity is below the United States. Our personal disposal income is below the United States. We're not growing. Our personal disposal income, real incomes haven't grown in something like 15 years. Is part of it because we put too much red tape on our natural resource sector?
It's the biggest part, Brian. And you saw, I'm a special advisor with the Business Council, and I had the pleasure of sitting in one of their forums recently, so there's more than 100 plus CEOs. Nick Nanos was there, did a real-time poll of the CEOs in the room. What was the number one problem that they saw with Canadian competitiveness? The regulatory system. And it's bad for natural resources. It's not very good for tech. It's not very good for grocery. Everyone is getting murdered by this government with red tape. So it has that finally enough layered on, trickled down that all Canadians are seeing it, and we've dug a hole where everyone is saying, wow, we really need to do something different. Yes, but I'm telling you, it's been 6 years, 8 years in the coming, and it'll be a few years to dig out of it now.
So if you were the Minister of the Environment or Minister of Natural Resources, what would you do?
Well, this is the easiest, so the Conservatives are going to come in. I mean, the polls are looking one way, so eventually there'll be a different government. There's a pretty good chance that different government will be in 2025. And they were going to come in and Pierre Poilievre is saying, oh, we're going to repeal C-69. That's very popular with the base. And I would have predicted, well, there's going to be tremendous opposition. And the pendulum is going to swing from left to right. And there'll be, instead of protests in Calgary, there's going to be protests in Montreal. And let me tell you, industry doesn't like that either. They're sick and tired of the polarization, sick and tired of the pendulum. All the Conservatives have to do now is say, we're going to change this to be consistent with what the Supreme Court ordered. And basically all industry wants is one project, one assessment. All industry wants is for the federal government to respect provincial jurisdiction and not have to have two processes. It is so easy for the Conservatives to just come in and say, we are changing in accordance with the Supreme Court of Canada, our regulatory system. The Liberals were unconstitutional, we're going to be constitutional. And so that is the opportunity for me, is just to respect provincial jurisdiction and have one project, one assessment. But
isn't that make a constitutional bad deal rather than what you want, which is a whole new deal?
Well, we have to have an impact assessment act. So you can't just repeal it and have a vacuum. There are some things that only the federal government does. If it's on federal lands, that's federal jurisdiction. If it's nuclear, it should be federal jurisdiction. For rail, it should be federal jurisdiction. If it's mine, it should be provincial. If it's refinery, it should be provincial. If it's a pipeline within a province's borders, it should be provincial. So if it's an LNG terminal, well, it's a little trickier because that goes into the offshore. But the point
is in almost every pipeline across the provincial border or national border?
Only with the ones that you guys hear about. There's like 3: Energy East, TMX, and Northern Gateway. The only reason you heard about it was because they were interprovincial pipelines. It's Google pipelines in Alberta. There are thousands of kilometers of pipe in Alberta within Alberta's jurisdiction. But what the IAA did is they said, if it's over 75 kilometers, we're going to make it, and we're going to put under federal assessment. And so that's the one where for Alberta, that was a hard pill to swallow, because it's one thing to regulate the TMX, which they still have to. But it's another thing to regulate an 80-kilometer natural gas pipeline within Alberta's borders, which they did, which they delayed, which they deferred in the middle of an energy crisis. They absolutely did that.
Okay, so just make the new Impact Assessment Act constitutional. That's it. Period. Full stop.
Adhere to the principle of one project, one assessment, and respect each other's jurisdiction. Don't duplicate processes and add red tape. Respect the jurisdiction. And here's the federal government, this federal government's thinking is that only they care about the environment. Only they care about Indigenous peoples. And for me, that's quite arrogant to think. But all the provinces have competence, not, they have the constitutional competence. It's their job under the Constitution to do this regulation. If the provinces fail, the recourse isn't to go to Big Brother, the federal government. Federal government is not their big brother, it's their peer. The recourse is to go to the courts. If a province violates Indigenous rights, go to the courts. If the province, violates Canadians' right to a clean environment, you go to the courts. It's not for the federal government to tell the provinces what to do under our Constitution. This isn't a partisan talking point. This is how Canada was designed.
Yes, we also take a constitutional class from Heather Exner-Pirot. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Sagan and 60. We're chatting tonight with Heather Exner-Pirot. She's an expert on natural resources and natural resource strategy and Indigenous relations and the Arctic, etc., with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Heather, you've been talking about how we have to be we could be a global superpower in energy, but we're not. We're a bystander. And you mentioned that we've recently done a deal with Venezuela that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, so this is the United States. This is the consequences of not looking even 3 years ahead on your energy policy. So then this is on Biden. This isn't so much on the federal Liberals. I'll give them a break on this. This is on the Biden administration, but just the whole thinking around oil and gas. Almost the first thing Biden did when he was elected president, so day one, January 2021, was to cancel the Keystone XL pipeline. And of course, environmentalists hate it. They hate all pipelines, try to block all pipelines. It was very unpopular with Democrats. It was a popular move for Biden to cancel that pipeline. It was already getting built. Canada had approved it on our side. What the Keystone XL pipeline would do is carry heavy oil. There's different grades of oil. Almost everything the United States produces is light and sweet, and Canada produces heavy and sour, especially in the oil sands. It would have carried that heavy oil through the Keystone XL pipeline to refineries in the United States. Biden canceled that. Now we're seeing shortages. There's more demand than there is supply for heavy oil. And we're seeing some other geopolitical risk in the Middle East with Russia, obviously. And the United States, their shale revolution, they went so hard and so fast that their production is starting to peak in oil. Their production is peaking maybe even this year, and then it'll start to decline, and it'll be really noticeable in the next couple of years. And they will need to get some other oil from other places. It could have come from Canada through Keystone XL. What the Biden administration did this week was to negotiate an easing of sanctions with Venezuela, which still has an awful authoritarian dictatorship that has been terrible for the Venezuelan people, but is the other major producer of heavy oil. And they made a deal that Venezuela, if they have a fair election next time, can start, sending their heavy oil back to the United States and sell it to other customers. So here,
through the Gulf of Mexico.
Yes, exactly. So here,
seriously, for a second, what's safer environmentally, pipeline or tankers through the Gulf of Mexico?
Well, the way we do pipelines, it's only safer through a pipeline. Yeah, because you can detect it and you can deal with it in a smaller environment whether it's going all the way from Venezuela to the Gulf of Mexico. So if you have a spill, it's, of course it's going to be catastrophic. More importantly, people say, people know the oil sands have a high GHG intensity. All heavy oil has a high GHG intensity, but some things you need heavy oil for. For a lot of petrochemicals, for a lot of hydrocarbon products, you have to have heavy oil. You cannot do it with light sweet. That's why the refiners require it. You have to get heavy oil from somewhere. I promise you, Venezuela does not have a $75 billion plan to decarbonize, but the Canadian oil sands do.
What's the business environment in Calgary for the oil and gas sector like right now, for the natural resource sector, for the Romanian business?
Well, I do have to say, things are looking up because prices are high, because we have restricted supply and demand there's pretty much a new record for global demand. There will be a new global demand record this year. And there'll be a new one next year. So global demand is still going up. We haven't been doing a good job of increasing supply because of climate change policy. And so prices are going to go up. So we are seeing in Alberta and Saskatchewan also, and Newfoundland, record production, record profits, record royalties. Last year, Canada got $31 billion in royalties from oil and gas, different provinces. $31 billion in royalties, $11 billion in corporate taxes paid from oil and gas. So those high prices absolutely help the Canadian bottom line, and absolutely help our, our balance of trade and all those kinds of things. So people are feeling pretty good. TMX is coming online in early 2024. That's going to give them capacity for another 500,000 barrels that we can finally sell to an Asian market and not have to rely on the United States. That will increase the price, that will narrow the differential so that we'll be able to have some options and customers. So things are actually looking pretty good. Now with the IAA decision, feels like the sky is starting to be the limit again.
Heather Exner-Pirot, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to finish with a couple of my own thoughts on this topic, and I think Heather's done a great job of outlining the issues, but I do think that we should be an energy superpower. I think we should not be a bystander. I think that on balance, environmental issues and assessment issues and red tape have taken way too much attention of the federal government and of the media and our energy opportunities, the critical mineral opportunities that Heather's talked about, and the economic opportunities have played second fiddle. And I think it's really only come to people's attention during this last 2 years because of the war in Ukraine and the geopolitical issues. And we've seen how Russia has had an influence, a negative influence on Europe because of their control over oil and gas. And I think that for the first time, we've started to pay a little bit more attention to the issue. And I think Heather's done a good job of explaining how this is going to play out even potentially far worse with critical minerals in the future as we switch to electrical cars, batteries, et cetera, that are using lithium and other critical minerals. So I do think that this is something that we need to pay a lot of attention to. I met someone this morning, Heather, and it was talking about land development, I have to admit, but they were saying, you wouldn't believe the red tape. I had to deal with a city government and then a conservation authority and then a local community organization and then the regional government and then the provincial government. I just want to deal with one level of jurisdiction. And I completely agree that they have the responsibility to assess whether my development makes sense, but don't make me do it 5 times and have 5 different rules and lots of different opinions from lots of different people about what I should change. And I think that this excess of red tape, excessive regulation, and opinions that get in the way, and what this individual also said is excessive politicization of regulatory process. Let the experts do the regulatory review. Don't let the politics too often get in the way. I think is an issue in land development. I think it's an issue in oil and gas. I think it's an issue in a lot of different industries. When I was in the pharmaceutical industry, I don't think politics got involved, but certainly lots of red tape got involved. So I think it is an issue that we need to address. There's just no question about it. And if we address it and we put time and attention, I think that number one, it's going to create great business opportunities for Heather and her friends in Calgary. I think it's going to create great royalties and taxation for the federal government. And I think it's going to go a long way to addressing our productivity challenges and our income imbalance with the United States, which will be beneficial to us all. Anyway, that's my 2 cents. Thank you, Heather. That's our show for tonight, everybody. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Calgary, Alberta at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videocasts are available on briancrombie.com, and you can probably see about 4 interviews with Heather Exner-Pirot on different topics on briancrombie.com. Good night, everybody. Thanks, Heather.